Joining us for CBN NewsWatch, I'm Brody Carter. Today, the Middle East heating up as Iran announces a new uranium enrichment facility which could be used for building nuclear weapons. And the U.S. order the evacuation of non-essential personnel from embassies in the region. All of this as Hamas attacks humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. Here at home, still more protests in Los Angeles against President Trump's crackdown against illegal immigrants, as the administration warns protests in other cities may also be met with military force. And a tragic airline crash today. A Boeing jetline in India goes down with more than 240 people on board. And does the Republicans' tax cut and budget bill still spend too much money, even after the spending cuts? One economist says it does, and those stories are coming to you with more today on NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin in the Middle East as the threat of war seems to be increasing. Iran announcing today it will establish a new uranium enrichment facility in a secure location, which could be used for building nuclear weapons. That move coming after the UN Nuclear Watchdog's Board of Governors found that Iran isn't complying with its nuclear obligations for the first time in 20 years. And the U.S. is prepping partial evacuations of several embassies in the Middle East after Iran threatened U.S. personnel in the region. Those developments come as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation reported a devastating attack by Hamas on its workers. CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell brings us the story.
The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation released a statement saying Hamas targeted their workers. On Wednesday night, Hamas brutally attacked a bus carrying more than 24 members of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's team. What we know is devastating. At least 8 fatalities, multiple injuries, and fears that some of our team members may have been taken hostage. GHF says the workers were Palestinians working to deliver critical aid to needy Gazans. Since its operation began, the organization has delivered nearly 19 million meals. It's calling on the international community to condemn the attack, which they call a crime against humanity. Senator James Lankford posted on X called it the ultimate sign of Hamas's oppression against their own people. Tensions are high in the region overall. The U.S. State Department has ordered the departure of all non-essential personnel from U.S. embassies in Baghdad, Bahrain, and Kuwait due to unrest. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth authorized the voluntary departure of military dependents from locations across the region. Speaking at the Kennedy Center in Washington, President Trump said they are being moved out because it could be a dangerous place, and we'll see what happens. Iran's defense minister said he hopes nuclear talks will yield results, but if not, he warned the U.S. that all its bases are within our reach. We will have access to them, and we will target all of them in the host countries without hesitation. While the 6th round of talks are being scheduled for this Sunday in Oman, Trump is expressing skepticism about whether a deal can be reached. On the podcast, Pod Force One, Trump stated,
I'm getting more and more less confident about it. They seem to be delaying, and I think that's a shame, but I'm less confident now than I would have been a couple of months ago. Something happened to them.
Jonathan Conricus of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies believes the time for diplomacy passed long ago.
There is still enough time to act. The means are there, the capabilities are there, and what needs to be done is for the world to take clear, unequivalent action, not diplomatic talks, not allow the cunning and silver-tongued Iranian negotiators to wiggle their way out of the situation, but to take real action on the ground after 15 years of diplomatic efforts and with unequivocal evidence that the Iranians are lying and they are trying to build a nuclear bomb. Action needs to be taken, and I hope that decision makers in Washington, D.C. and in European capitals are paying attention and understand the full severity of the situation here.
Israel reports it's recovered the bodies of 2 more hostages in Gaza, including Yair Yaakov, who was killed in Hamas's brutal October 7th invasion of Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's Knesset voted down a bill that would collapse the government and lead to new elections.
Chris Mitchell is live from Jerusalem. He joins us now. Let's start with Iran. Obviously, they've announced a new nuclear enrichment site today, which could be used for building nuclear weapons. And it seems like President Trump is getting doubtful about a deal, Chris. Is the possibility of a strike on Iran getting more likely?
Well, it seems like that, and a lot of people think we may be on the cusp of a war here in the Middle East. It looks like it's getting closer. Some people believe these developments, Trump's statement, and what the Iran defense minister is saying could be all posturing about the negotiations. There is scheduled talks this coming Sunday in Oman, but whether or not they happen remains to be seen. But it does seem like the positions on both sides seem to be hardening. The IAEA declaring Iran non-compliant, and then Iran discovering or saying that they're going to have a new nuclear facility in a secure location. This was the first time in 2 decades that the IAEA said that Iran was non-compliant. They are a nuclear threshold state right now. And so many things are happening, Brody. The evacuations all point to a potential strike by the U.S. and or Israel and against Iran's nuclear program. So we remain to be seen. Certainly a time for people to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem and for the entire Middle East.
I know it's a lot to be following, and you mentioned those evacuations. Iran is threatening to strike U.S. bases throughout the region, and non-essential American personnel are being evacuated. How serious are those directives?
Well, serious, Brody, and possible moves before a potential war or military action. This all follows the Iran's defense minister threat. As he said in our report, all bases are within reach. So that means that not only will they be potentially striking at Israel, but all the U.S. air bases, military bases throughout the region. This could be a strategic buffer, just to remove vulnerable targets like the family of dependents, while on the other hand, keeping all of its military, the U.S. military, that is, capability intact. It also signals to Tehran and U.S. allies in the region that the military threat is credible. And if diplomacy falters, a military response remains on the table. And so they're taking these preventative steps. It doesn't mean that war's begun, but it does mean that if negotiations collapse or if Iran retaliates, this is something that the U.S. is preparing for.
Well, Chris, let's turn now to this horrible attack on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, the GHF says it's collecting more information. There's no confirmation right now about whether or not some of these workers were taken hostages. They had considered closing all their sites today, but they decided, given the security risks and safety concerns, but after weighing that, they said the best response would be to keep those sites open. So they keep delivering the food to the people of Gaza. And so that they believe are counting on them. Believe it or not, 19 million meals in just the last couple of weeks, Brody. It's really remarkable what's happened, and it's really shifted the balance of power in the Gaza Strip, removing it from Hamas, that has been using this humanitarian aid as leverage over the people by selling the food back to their own people and making money. But the GHF is really providing food security for many of the people now in the Gaza Strip.
It's amazing what these humanitarian groups are doing, and you'd mentioned food security. Is there any security protections that could be put in place to help protect the humanitarian workers?
Well, you would think so, and I would imagine one of my first thoughts after this was that there would be a full security review to try to protect these workers that are really vulnerable, because Hamas is calling them traitors against the Palestinian cause. And so I'm sure there's going to be a review why they weren't better protected. They are living in a war zone, extremely difficult and dangerous conditions. It could be that this would be more one incident to turn the Gazans against Hamas. On the other hand, I'm sure some of these people may have felt that these people were traitors to the Palestinian cause.
Sir, what are the implications of the Knesset vote on the Netanyahu government?
Well, it means the Netanyahu government survives. The people that brought up this bill can't bring it up for another 6 months. So ever since this government was formed, before October 7th, it's remained remarkably resilient. Smotrich, who is the finance minister, he had warned that bringing down the government during a wartime would have posed an existential danger to Israel. Apparently, his argument won the day. But the whole issue, Brody, remains. And the issue is that the ultra-Orthodox that do not serve in the IDF, it's been a divide in Israel for years. The secular people resent that. The religious people say this is something that we believe God's called us to do. So while the government has survived, the issue plaguing Israel now for decades won't be going away.
Our CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell, thank you as always for your insights. We'll be praying for you and your team. Still ahead, more protests in Los Angeles against President Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration, as the administration warns protesters that other cities may also face a military response. We'll have that story for you and more when we come back. Tensions remain high in Los Angeles amid widespread protests against immigration raids. President Trump has deployed thousands of National Guard troops in what California Governor Gavin Newsom calls a brazen abuse of power. As those protests begin spreading to other cities across the country, the chaos is also being felt in Washington. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Michelle London has this story.
We all stand in support and solidarity and call for the raids to end.
The sixth night in a row of civil unrest for parts of the downtown area. Protesters seen running as officers mounted on horseback move in, clearing the streets, enforcing another night of curfews. More than 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines standing guard on the streets of L.A. Wednesday night, as anger over the Trump administration's immigration crackdown and the deployment of federal troops to L.A. now boils over into other major U.S. cities. From Baltimore to Chicago, where a car drove through a group of demonstrators. In Seattle, protesters seen clashing with police. Meanwhile, a mixture of cheers and boos for the president Wednesday night. When arriving at the Kennedy Center in the nation's capital, he defended his decision to deploy National Guard troops and Marines in Los Angeles.
If I didn't act quickly on that, Los Angeles would be burning to the ground right now.
I said of LA! I said of LA!
Anybody who breaks the law, anybody who assaults police officers, anybody who destroys property should be held accountable to the full extent of the law.
Tensions also reached Capitol Hill between lawmakers Wednesday as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats criticized the president's decision. And Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries addressed the recent destruction.
At the same time, we respect the right and should embrace the right for any American to peacefully protest.
Republican Senator John Barrasso called the L.A. clashes a threat to safety, then condemned Schumer and L.A.'s leaders for describing the demonstrations as peaceful.
California governor, Los Angeles mayor, call them out, Gavin Newsom, Karen Bass, unable and unwilling to restore the law. They refuse. They have coddled the criminals from day one. And many of these criminals are illegal immigrants.
The Trump administration warning a military response may not be limited to Los Angeles, saying protesters in other cities could be met with equal or greater force. Michelle London, CBN News, Washington.
Meanwhile, an al-Qaeda leader issued a call to assassinate President Trump and other U.S. government leaders. According to the Middle East Media Research Institute, Saad bin Atif al-Awlaki released a video titled Inciting the Believers, calling for attacks on U.S. leaders, military forces, and the economy, as well as Jews. Al-Awlaki specifically mentioned President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Elon Musk. He also incited Muslims in the U.S. and Europe to target Jewish populations, saying, quote, "Do not leave a safe place for the Jews." And a tragic air accident to report to you this morning. Air India says its London-bound flight that crashed shortly after takeoff from Ahmedabad Airport Thursday included people from India, Britain, Portugal, and Canada. There were 232 passengers and 12 crew members on board the flight, which had been bound for London's Gatwick Airport. India's civil aviation minister posted on X that rescue teams have been mobilized and all efforts are being made to ensure medical aid and relief support on site. Still ahead, will the government still be spending too much under the Republican tax cut and budget bill now being considered by the Senate? We'll hear from one economist who says more needs to be done to get federal spending under control. The big, beautiful bill. Is it a budget-busting boondoggle or sound tax policy for the future? Texas Tech economist Alexander Salter believes excessive government spending is a contributing cause of inflation and must be reined in. Appearing on this week's episode of The Global Lane, Salter explains why he believes the current bill under consideration by the Senate doesn't get the job done.
I think some of the trade-offs that Republicans in Congress and the House and the president felt that they had to make with this current version of the bill are pretty unfortunate. Don't get me wrong. I like tax cuts as much as the next guy. I like codifying the tax cuts that we got in 2017, making them permanent. But we also got some tax policies that, frankly, don't make a whole lot of economic sense. The SALT deduction, that doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. Exempting tips and overtime, things like that are ultimately going to be more distortionary and actually do forsake needed revenue. I don't think most people understand just how indebted the national government has become. If you're going to cut taxes, great, but you got to make sure that you cut spending more. And this bill does not even come close to that. So this is continuing to rack up the tab that's ultimately going to be borne by future generations that can't yet even defend themselves at the ballot box.
It's going to be hard to make those deeper cuts because people are already complaining about job reductions, some of the proposed DOGE cuts and waste and spending. And, of course, as you mentioned, they think those are popular, the no tax on tips and things like that. So how do you do it?
Everyone likes the idea of spending cuts until it's time to cut spending. And then people realize, wait, it might be my preferred program that has to take a haircut. And then everything goes to pieces. The fact of the matter is there's only so much money in discretionary spending. If we're actually going to get the long-term fiscal trajectory of the federal government under control, we need to be more serious about entitlement reform. Unfortunately, the president has made it clear that to him, that's a non-starter. I think the American public need to understand that when the president says that, what he's saying is balancing the budget as a non-starter. So that's yet another broken campaign promise.
And when Chairman Powell met recently with President Trump, he told him the Fed's interest rate decisions are, quote, based solely on careful, objective, and non-political analysis. Is Trump wrong to push the Fed to lower rates? And do you believe the Fed must not bow to political pressures?
So I think in these sorts of discussions, we sometimes conflate two kinds of independence for our central bank. You sometimes hear this idea that political officials, elected officials, should never have anything to do with central banking. And that just can't be true. The Federal Reserve was created by Congress. The Constitution of the United States vests the monetary policy powers in Congress, and Congress chose to delegate those powers to the Fed. Frankly, every president since Eisenhower has tried to informally influence Fed chairs. President Nixon famously, or I should say infamously, persuaded then Fed Chairman Burns to loosen monetary policy on the eve of his reelection. Even President Reagan, who gets credit for the boom of the economic boom of the 1980s, leaned on Paul Volcker in the early days of the Volcker disinflation. So I think that we need to be really careful about this idea of presidents interfering in monetary policy decisions to help their electoral prospects. We should want Congress to be calling the shots. We shouldn't want the president interfering with day-to-day monetary policy decisions.
And Alexander, you wrote recently in the Washington Examiner that the Fed can help Uncle Sam pay its bills, or it can promote economic stability. It cannot do both. You end the article saying you're increasingly skeptical of the Fed making the right choice. Why is that?
Yeah, that's right. It's simply true that the Fed, if it wants to, can print up a whole bunch of money and buy government bonds, thereby lowering government borrowing costs, at least in the short run. And the Fed has done that. Many times throughout history, it's done that, most recently during the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic. From 20 to 22, the size of the balance sheet almost doubled. The Federal Reserve purchased trillions of dollars of new government bonds because, in part, they were concerned with the integrity of the market for government debt, the market for Treasury securities. That's a very important market, and I can partly understand why monetary policymakers are concerned to keep functionings there smooth. But the fact of the matter remains that so long as they're concerned with helping Uncle Sam borrow, we're ultimately going to lose control over the dollar's purchasing power, because the inevitable result of that is inflation, as we saw starting in summer 2022 when consumer price inflation reached almost 10%. And so I think that the Fed should be concerned with maintaining full employment and stable prices and not help Uncle Sam pay its bills. Fiscal policymakers should stick to fiscal policy. Monetary policymakers should stick to monetary policy. If you cross that bridge, the only predictable result is going to be crippling dollar depreciation.
Okay, we'll know in a few days if the Fed decides to lower interest rates. Young Voices contributor, economics professor Alexander Salter, thank you for taking the time to share your insights. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary.
Extremely insightful. Also on this week's episode of The Global Lane, deepfake crime and artificial intelligence, evil unleashed. Also, why Americans will celebrate both the U.S. flag and Fathers this weekend. You can see it all. That'll be on The Global Lane tonight on CBS News Channel at 8 Eastern. You can also see it on the CBN News app or on YouTube. We'll be right back with an encouraging word for your day still ahead. Well, did you get a chance to see this morning's strawberry full moon? It was gorgeous. I tried to snap a picture of it. Never does justice. But nonetheless, it still reminds us the heavens are still speaking. Psalm 19 says the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. The news can be heavy, and even when the world feels dark, God's creation keeps declaring his glory. Let that remind you and encourage you that he's still near. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can find more of our news programming on the CBN News Channel anytime, online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories that you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. Talk to us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and we hope that you'll join us next time. Have a great day.